Welcome, everyone. This is Deborah Dudak from the Fountaindale Public Library and the Bolingbrook Historic Preservation Commission. And this year, I'm super excited to bring to you the Boardman Cemetery open house. It's a virtual tour that we're doing this year. It's unfortunate we're not able to open the cemetery for Halloween this year, but we wanted to make sure that everybody got a chance to at least come through our beautiful cemetery virtually. And with the ability of the software and the technology that we have, I can add more photos, more details, and more side stories that I don't really get a chance to do when we're having our open houses in person. So please feel free to like, to subscribe, and to share this beautiful tour with everybody that you know, because we're really, really excited. We want you to come visit our cemetery if we have the chance. We are taking appointments for the cemetery. Just call the township and make arrangements to get a one-on-one tour with one of the Bolingbrook Historic Preservation Commissioners. So without that, let's walk through the gates of our beautiful cemetery. Our cemetery is located on Paxton Drive, which is right off Royce Road in Upper Bolingbrook, almost to the city limits of Naperville. So as we come in through our cemetery and up the hill, because it is on a nice little hill, our cemetery was established on the property of Captain Harry Boardman, who was one of the local heroes of the Black Hawk War. When you enter the facility, or when you enter the cemetery itself, one of the first things that you'll notice is that none of the headstones seem to have inscriptions on them. This is not for us to be clever. This is not a practical joke. It's actually because the cemetery itself is backward. So the original entrance to the cemetery was actually where there's a line of houses right on the back of the property. So what you're entering on when you enter Paxton is actually what would have just been an open field. Now, when the subdivision was developed on that property, 170 odd years later, the safest way for you to enter the property and not go through someone's backyard is to enter the cemetery off Paxton Road. But this is actually a photo if you're standing at the back of the cemetery. Now you can actually see. It doesn't look just like a hill filled with stones without any information on them. They look just like a cemetery, and it looks gorgeous because of the heavy-handed restoration work that the Bolingbrook Historic Preservation Commission, Landmark Illinois, Fountaindale Public Library, Page Township, and occasionally other donors who have come in, family donors and descendants of individuals who are buried in the cemetery, have made sure that we've been keeping our cemetery in tip-top shape, making a lot of not only headstone cleanings, but making sure we're making vital repairs to the property. And it looks fabulous. This is far from the decrepit, old, creepy cemetery that I know a lot of people are used to in movies and television shows, but our cemetery is on a really great pathway to not only keeping it up and keeping it looking nice, but making sure that the markers and the other inscriptions are well cared for and the property is well cared for at all time. So when we actually Boardman Cemetery, taking a look at it, people say, well, how big is our cemetery? Our cemetery is about 1/4 of an acre, and it's also home to approximately 107 headstones. There are some various headstones which are yet to be repaired and yet to be re-erected. We also have a collection of footstones, which again, we'll go through and try to have those repaired and re-erected as well. And so far, through the work of not only the Historic Preservation Commission, but also through grants from Historic Landmark Illinois and the Village of Bolingbrook and Page Township and the Fountaindale Public Library, we've been able to really, really get in there and repair at least 20 headstones. And that's everything from items that have fallen to the side, also to have them put back up, but also making sure that vital conservation work is being made on our headstones. So we try every year to make sure we have our little list of to-do, honey-do items, and we get in there and make the repairs that we have the funds and time and specialty to be able to do. Now, the big question I get when I'm on our tours is how many people are actually buried in Boardman Cemetery? And that's a question. We have 103 headstones, but we weren't quite sure how many people were actually buried. Remember, Illinois doesn't start keeping state issued death certificates until 1916, which seems a little bit late. Now, starting in the late 1880s, counties started keeping death certificates, or at least death records, death ledgers, but we don't often have an opportunity to go through every single ledger book, and it doesn't say exactly where everybody is buried. So we only kind of had a guesstimation based on the headstones. But back in 2017, we actually, through a grant through Landmark, Illinois, Page Township, the library, and the Historic Preservation Commission, we actually received the funding to do what's called a ground penetrating radar project. Now, this is a non-invasive, completely harmless process of what looks like a lawnmower that goes on the property. You just go back and forth, just as if you're mowing the lawn, and it picks up, sends our sonar signals down through the earth, and then those signals bounce back up. And by having this and going through our entire property of Boardman Cemetery, they're actually able to pick up how many people are buried in the cemetery grounds themselves, because the markers may not be there, but it doesn't mean the bodies aren't still there. And through our final survey results, that we concluded that Boardman has approximately 80 unmarked burials on the property. And we do have some anomalies. So the red markers that you'll see in this Google map, all of the green ones, of course, are burials, and you'll see the little clumps. You'll see where we actually do have some headstones that you can actually see from Google Earth, and you'll see where those individuals are buried in fairly straight rows, I would say. Now, anything in red is an abnormality, so we're not quite sure if it's a burial, if it's an older hitching post, if it's maybe a tree that was taken off the property at some point. We just don't know about these little missing pieces inside of our survey. But maybe in a couple of years, technology will change and we'll have the grant money to go back through and do another survey. But for the moment, now that we know we have close to 200 people buried on the property, that gives us a lot of peace of mind that we know how that we can start to kind of create our cemetery in the aggregate by going through additional resources like newspapers, census records, school records, land deeds, all of that sort of resources, so we can start rebuilding our cemetery in the aggregate. But let's start in the back of our cemetery where we would have originally come through one of our back entrances. We're going to go past the Jonathan and Polly Royce monument, past the Turner Row. We're going to walk up to the Smith section of the cemetery, or the Smith burial plot, and you'll notice that by the large marker that's way to the left, and to the marker that says Caroline on it. Past Caroline and Reuben Smith, or just Ruby as we like to call him, he's one of the many children buried in our cemetery. And we're going to head right to the first known burial in Boardman Cemetery, and this is the marker for Elizabeth Cleveland. She was buried here in the spot in November 20th, 1832. So she is the first resident of our cemetery. And what we know about Elizabeth is that not only, yes, she's the wife of Josiah Cleveland, but in all of the materials that we found that outline the history of Boardman Cemetery, everyone just refers to her as Mrs. Cleveland, which you'll see a lot of women's history from this time period kind of get swept under the rug a little bit. There's a lot on the men, but not so much on the women. Our researchers with the Historic Preservation Commission are working to reverse that quite a bit. What I can tell you about Elizabeth Cleveland is, yes, she was 55 years old, seemed to have died of some sort of natural cause. It could have been old age. It could have been something as simple as a flu or a pneumonia. But her headstone is of vital importance to us because as the first headstone, it actually carries some of the earliest iconography of cemetery symbolism within our cemetery. So on that is the symbol of a weeping willow. Now, a weeping willow, yes, we do have the connotation of, yes, it looks like the tree is eternally weeping, but it's also one of the few trees that if you keep pulling the small willows off, they grow back and they regrow. So part of it is about an eternal sort of mourning symbol that we see in cemetery symbolism. Now, as right next to her, we actually have John Raymond, which is interesting because I have to make sure I get this right. His name is actually Johann Michael Sigmundsson Rasmussen Raymond, and he was born in Copenhagen, Denmark. So you don't often see this on a headstone. Again, he Mr. Raymond died in 1853, but there's nothing on his headstone that designates this incredible story that he has behind his name. So Mr. Raymond immigrated to the United States. We kind of estimate he arrives in Chicago somewhere around 1838, 1839. And he might have made the journey to Chicago from New York, taking the Erie Canal up to Buffalo, New York, taking a steamship. So one of the steamships that were in the Great Lakes from Buffalo, New York, down past Ohio, up across the Gulf of Michigan, back down into Lake Michigan, and then finally making it into Chicago. So while he's that whole trip itself, or at least the trip from Buffalo to Chicago, took about 16 days and only took place in the spring, summer, and early fall. In the wintertime, Chicago was completely locked out from any outward supplies. So when Mr. Raymond came to this area, he knew he's going to have to get the boat sometime within that warm weather period to be able to come out here and make a living for himself. Now, he was on as far as what we know a little bit about him, that he was married, that he and his wife had 4 children. And in the 1950 census, he actually labels himself as a ship's captain, or a captain of a lake vessel. Mr. Raymond is also one of the few people that we have in the cemetery where we actually have an image. We know what this guy looked like. But this is one of the vessels that was known to be on the Great Lakes. So he could have been one of those guys who's actually taking the steamers and driving or steering the steamers from Chicago back to Buffalo, from Chicago to Toledo, from Chicago to Sandusky, or from Chicago to Cleveland. So there was a lot of shipping activity going on in the Great Lakes during that time period, and Mr. Raymond was part of it. Now, he was a ship's captain, but he was also a landowner, which is why he's out here in Boardman Cemetery, which is why he didn't end up in Chicago. So out here in Will County, he owned a farm that was approximately 160 acres. So while he's out on the shipping lines, taking ships to and from their locations, his wife and their kids are helping to take care of the livestock that are on that farm. Now, they had not only that sort of like livelihood of small time farm work, but also the income coming in from his shipping interests, or from his shipping career. So he certainly he had, I think at one point he had listed 2 horses, 5 milk cows, and 5 pigs on his property. So it's a family farm. They are farming, but he has a really great income coming in from that ship, from his ship's captain work. So, you know, he's certainly not a dirt poor farmer. And that's what we need to kind of set aside, that the people in this area were just dirt poor farmers who didn't have anything. That is not the case. A lot of the people who are up on Royce Road, or what is today Royce Road in Bolingbrook, most of them became very affluent. Most of them made an excellent living, and most of them had the type of livestock and social connections to be able to rise up within their community. So we're going to say goodbye to Johann Raymond, and we're going to walk from past Elizabeth Cleveland, and we're going to walk toward the Boardman family plot. Now, the Boardman plot is of only 2 plots that are actually marked aside by these concrete pillars and chains. And they're also set aside, as you'll see, with the intricate brickwork. There's only 2 plots in the cemetery that have this set aside, and the Boardmans have the largest. And of course, the hero of this family plot in the patriarch is Captain Harry Boardman, a hero of the Black Hawk War. Now, Captain Boardman is buried here with his wife, Lavinia, and several of their children. So at the top left, you'll see the second, what we believe to be the second burial in Boardman, and that is for Clark Boardman, who was only a year and a half when he passed in early, so it would have been January 1833. Remember, Elizabeth Cleveland passed in November 1832. Clark was more than likely the second burial in the cemetery, and he's buried within the Boardman plot itself. Now, many of the Boardman children, or at least several of them, are here. Some are grown and interred on the site, but there are several who are children, and very small children, who are interred on the site as well. Now, Captain Boardman, being the captain of a company of men from the area who were volunteered for the Black Hawk War. You'll see a lot of names on this document that's from the Illinois Adjutant General's office. And on here, you'll see some names that look pretty familiar. So you'll see Joseph Napier and John Napier, both of whom helped found Naperville, which is right next door. You'll also see on this list that there is another, there's Robert Strong, who we'll see later in the tour. You'll see Seth Westcott, who is also mentioned on this tour, but you'll also see some names that are familiar to the area, like the Babbitts and the Fosters and the Stowells and the Whitneys and the Hobsons. So all of those individuals are participating in the Black Hawk War at some point. Now, if for people who don't really know a whole lot about the Black Hawk War, remember that this part of Will County was part of, at that time, Cook County. So Cook County, the primary fort in that area was Fort Dearborn, which was also the site of the Fort Dearborn massacre, which happened early during the War of 1812. So this whole area in itself of Chicago and all of the areas had grown out of the United States after the Revolutionary War and had become the Northwest Territories. That's where Chicago's Northwestern University gets its name from, because at that time we were the Northwest of the United States. But Old Fort Dearborn itself managed to survive all the way up to the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. When you go to Fort Dearborn today, so Captain Boardman and his men all would have at some point gone to Fort Dearborn to sign their papers, to get everything in order, to meet with the commanders, to talk about what they were going to do during the Black Hawk War. And they would have gone to the site that's pictured above. So that's Old Fort Dearborn before it burned down in the Great Chicago Fire. Now, when you're going to that site today, and below it, you'll see 3 photographs, you'll actually be able to go out on Upper Wacker Drive and actually see the outline of where the old fort was. So when you keep that in mind, make sure you have the picture at the top with you for a little bit of reference. So when you're on, I know it's really, really easy. There's a lot of really great art in Chicago, but when you pass by on Upper Wacker Drive and Michigan Avenue, you'll actually see the monument that's there to commemorate Fort Dearborn and the war of, not only the War of 1812, but the Black Hawk War as well. Now, it's important to keep in note here that, remember, Old Fort Dearborn is one of the stars on the Chicago flag. So when you're walking past this area, you're walking on the site of Old Fort Dearborn. But where most of the time that Captain Boardman and his men actually would have been out at Fort Payne, which is actually on the campus of North Central College in Naperville. So when you guys get a chance, if you guys have been on the campus of North Central College, you'll go by their field house and their football field. That's the site of Fort Payne. It's right on the DuPage River. And in this illustration, you'll see is a sketch of what that fort looked like at the time. It was basically a wooden stockade. A smaller scale replica of it is actually at the Napier settlement right across the river. So if you go to the Napier settlement, you go in the back of the Napier settlement area, they'll have the Fort Dearborn, the kids play area. That is a replica of Fort Payne. That's actually, you can go see and take a look at. Its layout is basically the same. But when you're on that campus of North Central College, you can actually walk right from Fort Payne to the Napier settlement on the Naperville Riverwalk, and you have yourself a nice little historic walking tour for anybody who's looking for something fun to do outside in the fall weather. Go take a walk from Fort Payne to the Napier settlement. So Captain Boardman, as we take a look at this list, here are some of the people from the area. Of course, we got Captain Boardman, Jonathan Boardman, Seth Westcott, the Blodgetts, Robert Strong. But I want to bring up the guy in the green, who's underlined in green, Pierrich Leclair. Now, this guy is cool. He's not buried here, which part of me really wish he is, but he's not. Pierrich Leclair actually has multiple name misspellings, so we're not quite sure exactly what his name would have been, but this is the closest thing that we can find in contemporary records of the time period. And he was the son of a French trader, and we believe that his mother was from the Potawatomi tribe, which was clustered around Chicago at that time period. So he grew up in Chicago at the time, where it really was a trading post primarily dominated by the local tribes of the First People who are situated in that area. Now, he grew up in speaking multiple languages. He essentially would help the American government and the tribes come to agreements. And during the War of 1812, he was responsible for defending and escorting people away from the Fort Dearborn massacre. So he was not only a veteran of that war, of War of 1812, because of the work he'd been doing protecting the settlers at Fort Dearborn, but then eventually he came out to our county, to Will County, into this area at Fort Payne, and out patrolling with Captain Harry Boardman and his men and protecting people during the war of the Black Hawk War. So not only do we have that history with the Indian boundary line out here in Bolingbrook, but we also have this really tried and true, amazing man who is out here. Besides the fact that he's helping people communicate with each other, he's trying to figure out a solution that's mutually beneficial to everybody around, but he's also working with a foot in two worlds, the white settlers who are coming from the east, and with the first people who are out here in this area as well, and trying to come to an agreement between the two. By the time this document is printed in 1857, this is actually a list of veterans from the Black Hawk War who were eligible for what's considered a land bounty. So this was issued by the federal government in 1855. So on that, because Pierre Leclair had rendered service not only during the War of 1812, but also during the Black Hawk War, he was entitled to 160 acres of land. Now, in this note, which unfortunately they didn't note it in this record, they had it in a side note, they actually said that he went west. So he went west with the first peoples who had signed treaties, and they went out further west, probably into Minnesota, maybe into Montana. We're not quite sure, but it just says that he went west. So we don't know exactly what happened to him, but we're really looking forward to doing more research on this gentleman, because he's such an amazing and unique figure in not only Cook County, but in Will County history as well. Really looking forward to know more about this guy. Now, let's go back to Royce Road. So as we can see, this is Royce Road, what it would have looked like back in 1871. So on the right, you actually see the farm of Horace Boardman, and to the left, you'll see Captain Boardman, Harry Boardman's farm. So as we're going up the road, you'll notice that both of these are a close approximation, but on the 1871 atlas of Will County, we actually find that near the Boardman farm was one of the local schoolhouses. So this was the first schoolhouse in the area. Now, in this description, they made the schoolhouse sound like it was on the property of Robert Strong, which is right down the road a little bit. But in 1871, either the schoolhouse had been moved or repurposed onto the Boardman family property. So it would have been super easy for all of the local kids to just walk down Royce Road and go to school at the little one-room schoolhouses. Remember, most of the one-room schoolhouses here in this area of Will County were operational well into the 1950s. So this little one-room schoolhouse, this isn't exactly the Boardman schoolhouse, but it's relatively close. It would have been just a one-room school with a chimney, and all the local kids would have come in and done their studies. So if you'd like to see what a one-room schoolhouse looks like from a little bit later in the time period, you can go to the Napier settlement. They have a wonderful recreated school. I highly advocate you get a chance to see it, just so you can see a similar experience to what some of the kids who were living on Royce Road would have experienced at that time period as well. So let's leave the Boardman family plot, and let's go over to the Freeman Plot. So this is the Freeman Plot. Right next door is Adeline and Cynthia Freeman. Now, they are not sisters. They are not married to each other. They were the first two wives of a man named Robert Freeman. Now, Adeline was his first wife. She's actually a Boardman, so her name was Adeline Boardman. She's the daughter of Captain Harry Boardman and his wife, Lavinia. Now, she has an amazing headstone here that we consider a bed headstone, because when you look at it from the back, it actually, her head looks like a headstone, and then the rest of it looks like a little bed. So we are hoping to do restoration work on this headstone at some point, and there's also some fragments of other headstones headstones that we need to take a look at some point, but she is buried there. Now, she was born and raised right in this area, right on Captain Boardman's farm on Royce Road. Next to her is Cynthia J., and her maiden name was Dewey. Her family lived in Winnebago County, so after Adeline died in childbirth, Robert Freeman, I guess, either had contacts or business relations or knew somebody who had an available wife or an available daughter to wed. And that's where Cynthia J. Dewey comes into play. So she also was married to Mr. Freeman, and just a couple of years into their marriage, she also died in childbirth. Now, with this string of bad luck and two wives who are now dead, Mr. Freeman's looked at his finances, realized he wanted to move a little bit closer to Naperville, so he ended up buying a house or building a brick house in 1876 in downtown Naperville, which eventually would be donated to North Central College. And then later, kids would go to school in that house, and unfortunately that house is now gone. However, when you take a look, Mr. Freeman is not actually buried in Boardman Cemetery. He's buried in the Naperville Cemetery in downtown Naperville. So this is Mr. Freeman. This is his headstone. This is his small, at least biography of him that was printed in the History of DuPage County from 1872. So he did have, besides the slew of children, his last wife was actually from DuPage. She was the daughter of Seth Westcott, who is actually buried just kitty corner from the Freeman Plot. Now, if people take a look at the Freeman farm, which is known as Valley Farm, through all of their paperwork, through all the obituaries, through all of the information we have on the Freemans, that this house is located on Royce Road. And it's one of, you'll see out here, here's all of the people kind of walking around the house, people playing croquet outside. I don't really think when they actually sketched the house that there were random people outside playing croquet. That's not really how a farm would have been operated. But Mr. Freeman was fairly wealthy. Besides owning a local grist mill, he also owned a massive amount of land, and he had a massive amount of livestock. So the man is certainly not hurting. But as it's also that this house, Valley Farm, or the Freedman Farm, this house is actually the last standing house on Royce Road that's original to the area. Just about everything else is gone, but the Freeman house itself in the 1970s was just on its last legs. No electricity, no running water, nothing, until a really amazing couple came by, scooped the house up, restored it, repaired it, put a lot of tender loving care into it, and now it stands as a jewel on Royce Road. And as you can see, the illustration isn't that far off. That's how we know about a lot of how the houses looked, how people live their lives, because a lot of these illustrations are so wonderfully, wonderfully correct. Now, this is an obit for Robert Freeman's daughter, Emma. Now, Emma is the daughter of Adeline Boardman and Robert Freeman. In her obituary, she actually talks about living in this house with her husband, Seth Westcott Jr., for the majority of her life. So she and her husband lived in this farm for almost 50 years, and upkeeping it and probably turning it into the Italianate gem that we see today. Really, really beautiful place. So as you walk by that house, remember, that's really a beautiful Bolingbrook gem. We're just so totally pleased it's still with us. So let's walk away from say goodbye to the Freeman Plot, and let's walk over to the Barber Plot. Now I'm not talking about a barber like Sweeney Todd or a barber who's going to cut your hair. I'm talking about John and Emma Barber and their daughter Ruth. Now this headstone we just restored just last year for their daughter Ruth, but as we go and we take a look at the cemetery, or for the headstone right next to it, to John and Emma Barber, this is where we get the term Barber's Corners from, is from this family here. And people ask, well, it's just the Barber farm, then what would make it so important that this is called Barber's Corners? Well, that's because no one's looking at the map from that time period. Now, this is Barber's Corners, and I know it's kind of hard to see because my face might be kind of in the middle of it, but you'll see that we have a photograph from the 1950s before we started to get a lot of buildup in Bolingbrook. You'll see something called Old Field Road. Now, that is Bounton Road until you get to 53. And then Bounton Road went from what we consider 53 out to what is now the 355 Expressway. So that Four Corners area, 3 sides of it were owned by John and Emma Barber. Their next neighbor, Seth Westcott, who was buried actually right down from them, he owned the other corner. But the Barbers owned 3 of the corners, which is why it's called Barber's Corners. So they had the majority. They also owned a cheese factory on their land. Now, you'll see that in the old photograph from the 1950s, you'll see and number 3 is, of course, the little schoolhouse. So you'll see on the 1871 map, you'll see the little schoolhouse. Number 1 on the 1950s map, that was actually a farm store or a general store. That was one of the original locations of one of the local churches. So that had been there in 1871 and then later moved. And then across from that on the Barber property was one of the farm stores that were for the area. Now, the Barbers, their property today, what's on it is Portillo's, Andy's Custard. You'll also see there's like a gas station across from them. There's a gas station, seems like, on every corner. But for the most part, their house would be where I think there's a Midas store or a brake or muffler store today. Their house is like right next to where Honey Jam Cafe and Portillo's would have been, just a little bit up from there. So that was the original site of the Barbers' actual house and barns and little garden plots of garden land for Emma to kind of putter around in. So because the Barbers had the majority of the corners, that's why it's called Barber's Corners or Barber Corner, all because of John and Emma Barber. So let's leave them behind. Let's say goodbye. And let's walk over to the Wayland stone. And I don't mean Wayland like I'm crying stone. I mean like the Wayland stone, Samuel Wayland and his wife, Lavinia. Now, Samuel Wayland is undoubtedly, he was one of the longest lived pioneers who's interred in our cemetery. He may have died in 1873, but by that time he was 91 years old. Now, Samuel Wayland himself, his land is actually, if the name sounds familiar, his land is the location of what is Wayland Lake today. So now Wayland is sometimes spelled with 1 L, sometimes with 2 L's. For the most part, we just cut it in between 1 L's, 2 L's, doesn't really matter to us. But if we look at the map that's down here from 1871, you can see that where his house and his land would be. And the other small blue circle at the top of that map, that's Boardman Cemetery. So that's where we are in our virtual land, in our virtual tour to where the Wayland property is today. So if you know where Wayland is, you can actually walk using one of the many trails and paved right-of-ways that have been put in by not only the Bolingbrook Park District, but the Naperville Park District. You can actually walk from the cemetery to Wayland Lake or from Wayland Lake to the cemetery without encountering any cars, which is really, really nice. But Judge Samuel Wayland, who served not only as a postmaster for the area, but also a judge. He was also a justice of the peace. He and his wife have undoubtedly one of the largest headstones in the cemetery, but they were also very active in their churches. So there were multiple churches out here in Bolingbrook, some of whom are Presbyterian, some were Episcopalian. There were even Mormons in the area. One of the first Mormon sermons heard in Will County was actually out in Plainfield. So it's kind of interesting to see how that religious revival of the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s really comes to play in rural areas like what we're seeing up on Royce Road here in Bolingbrook. So going next door, and this is what I like to say to Louisa, this is Louisa Braintree Wayland, if I can say it, Braintree, there's a couple of different ways to pronounce it. She's also one of the few people we actually have a picture for, who's buried in our cemetery. Now on the left, yes, there's our beautiful headstone, looks great. There's Louisa, hello Louisa. And right in front of us, on the right, this is the part of the tour where people ask me, is the cemetery haunted? I can tell you absolutely it is not haunted. I have been in this cemetery by myself countless times, not only helping with cemetery restoration work, but coming in to take photographs, to kind of pick up the tree limbs that fall down, going through and cleaning headstones if we have a cleaning schedule. But this is the headstone that when I bring everybody around on the Halloween tour, I take a look and I point out, because it's a little bright. This was a bright, beautiful day in September when I captured this footage. But what we get when we're at this headstone is this is the Wayland stone, but this is also what some people call the haunted stone. So actually in the middle of the picture, you'll see a big red circle that looks like a woman's profile from the side. So she has hair and eyes and a mouth, and she's looking at something that's coming from this direction. And the woman at the top, whose eyes are kind of hidden by half of her hair and her mouth is open because she's screaming because there's something right behind you. And that's when everybody jumps and small children start to cry. And I have to be really careful when I'm on that tour. But this is actually a combination of the way that the marble is cut on the headstone, but also the way that the small lictin and other sort of bacterial buildup accumulates on the headstone over time. So the Wayland stone was one of the last stones. We really don't want to clean it because it is left behind these two vestiges of what most people consider the most haunted stone in the cemetery. So what we may do is clean the majority of it and leave the portion that has the overgrowth on it, maybe as an example to show people how our bacterial destroying agent known as D2 works on headstones and how it brings it back to life in comparison to old with new. But part of me just thinks too, we should just probably just clean the whole stone, and maybe if we're lucky, the haunted ladies will come back. So we'll see. We'll think about it next year. So if you have a comment, leave us a suggestion. Should we keep it the way it is, or should we clean the headstone? So we'd love to hear what you think. So let's leave the Wayland property and say goodbye to Louisa and Samuel, and let's go over to the headstone of one of the other Black Hawk War veterans of Seth Westcott. His wife, Mary Jane, is buried here. This actually big headstone was put just for her. And then eventually Seth would join her about 20 years later. Now, this is actually a obituary for Seth Westcott's son, Seth Westcott Jr., who again married Emma Freeman, and they lived in the big blue house down the street. So, but in his son's obituary, it states that Seth Westcott came out here to the Will County, or what would have been Cook County at that time, DuPage area in 1826, with a group of oxen. And he actually stayed here for a couple of years, went back east, got married to Mary Jane, and then brought her out here to this area, and where they operated their own mill. So Seth Westcott, besides being a veteran of the Black Hawk War, he was one of the very first I wouldn't say legal clerks, but he was one of the first township clerks in the history of our area through a local election that was held in 1831. Now, the Westcott farm is not on Royce Road. So I need to make that really, really clear that even though Royce Road is super close, the Westcotts were on land that were, again, 3/4 of it were the Barbers, and then the other quarter belonged to Seth Westcott. So their land, which you'll see in the circle, in the yellow circle, their house and part of their gardens, it was weird because like their house and gardens were right on the road, and then you'd cross the road and that's where they would have most of their farmland or their land for livestock, whatever have you. So their house today is near where the Chase Bank is on Mountain Road, just to give you a little bit of reference. So if you know where Burritos Los Tapatios is and the Chase Bank and a couple of the little restaurants that are near there, that's where their house would be, near where the Chase Bank is today. So they were out here, and they do talk a little bit about some of the other relatives who are out in the area. But the Westcott land itself, if you're living near the Fountaindale Public Library, it's a good chance that your house, especially if you're living close to Brooks Middle School and the Fountaindale Public Library, that entire stretch of land all was Seth Westcott land at some point. So if you're always wondering, like, oh, I wonder what my house originally was part of, well, 10 to 1, if you're in this area, it's going to be on Seth Westcott land. Like, that's it. He owned most of it. It was absolutely prodigious. 400 acres of land worth about $8 grand in 1850 money. He made a lot of his money in sheep. He had at one point over 400 sheep. So he was not only raising sheep, but he had four horses, 2 oxen, several head of steer, 20 pigs, and all of that generated a pretty good income for his family, as well as that mill. So, like I said, not a dirt poor farmer. No dirt poor farmers out here. So let's leave the Westcotts and let's walk over to the Ingles Plot. Now, the Ingles Plot is really, really interesting. The headstone itself, when we found it, both for Henry and his wife Lois, the headstones were on the ground and the marker on top was also on the ground. So we actually had a descendants who actually lived near the area. They helped us perform some of our first headstone preservation by giving us the funds to be able to repair that headstone. But what we're going to do is we're actually going to stop on Henry and Lois's son, Andrew. Now, Andrew E., he was a veteran of the Civil War, so he's 2 Civil War veterans that we have buried in Boardman Cemetery. Andrew and his twin brother Abner both enlisted in the same unit in the same regiment. And what was interesting for Andrew and Abner is that they were really only in the service a few months before they were separated by death. So in the case of Andrew, he caught typhoid fever in a place called Gallon, Tennessee, which is near Nashville. And there was a family story we had heard that Mr. Ingles had, at that time, if you were private in the military, unless you paid ahead of time to have your body transported and sent home, it was more than likely that you were buried in one of the mass cemeteries that were near battlefields. Or in the case of Andrew, he, I think it was 2 out of every 5 people died of disease during the Civil War. Andrew died of typhoid. So there was a family story that his father actually got all the permission slips that he needed from the government to take the train down to go pick up his son's body and then bring it back and have it interred in the cemetery. And it was an interesting story, but we didn't really have any burial transit permits. We didn't have any sort of paperwork from that time period. There really wasn't much needed. There certainly wasn't anything filed at the county or the township level for us to take a look at. So when we did our ground penetrating radar project, that was actually the proof that we needed, because we can prove that, yes, Andrew is buried right where the family stories say that he is. Like, there is a body there, and it is more than likely Andrew. So yes, it is true that his parents brought him home. Now, his headstone, because he died in 1863, before a majority of the acts were established to provide free veterans headstones. Most of the time you see those really nice Civil War headstones that have the name of the person and then their rank and then what company or state they served from. You'll see those all through cemeteries throughout the United States. Those didn't start coming about until 1873 in national cemeteries and 1878 in private cemeteries. So Andrew's headstone, his parents paid for themselves in 1863. So when they had him brought home. So he does have a GAR, which is Grand Army of the Republic Star. And he does have a flag. Every Memorial Day, we always make sure that his headstone is clean and ready to go, and that he was the recipient of one of the remembrance ceremonies that we have for Memorial Day at Boardman. So Abner lived through the war, performed his military service exceptionally, and eventually moved to Aurora and helped establish one of the first electric companies in Aurora, which was kind of cool. So we've been still looking for a picture of Abner, because we would really love to see what he looked like. We were told they were identical twins, so I'm pretty sure that if we have a picture of Abner, we'll know what Andrew looked like. So that would be something that would be really cool. Maybe I'd have to invert it so let's see what they take a look like. kind of have them facing each other. We're going to walk past, out of the Ingles Plot, past Lydia, the wife of Samuel Goodrich, and their daughter, Sarah. And we're going to walk past them, and we're going to walk toward the Strong family plot. So I don't mean strong as in strong smelling or strength of arm strong, but no, Robert Strong, his wife Caroline, and at least 8 of their children. They had 11, but I believe 8 of them are here on the property in the Strong family plot. Not only them, but some of their wives and husbands and children as well. So Robert Strong, again, one of the few individuals we actually have a photo of buried in our cemetery. Huge farmer, not only that you'll see that he owned, I think at some point, like his big specialty was a steer. He raised a lot of cattle, but he had an immense amount of land, became a very wealthy man, served on the school board for over 16 years, served as a justice of peace for 16 years, very active in the community, very active in his church, very active in everything in civic life. Now he has not only, this is not really an obituary of him, but it's more of a biography from the history of DuPage County, because he did, his land kind of straddles that area of DuPage County and Will County. So most of his children and his wife, and he and his wife are buried here on this the Strong family plot in Boardman Cemetery. But this is where we get a really interesting term. People often wonder, you know, I'm not only work for the Fountaindale Public Library and help out with the Historic Preservation Commission and Bolingbrook, but people ask why the Fountaindale Public Library has its name. And you can actually find this in Robert Strong's information. So it says, Mr. Strong is the only old landmark left in the beautiful valley of Fountaindale. Just as Mr. Freeman's farm was called Valley Farm, this area was called Fountaindale. That was a placemaker name for it. And so that would have been very, very local to this area, that this whole area, just this Valley Farm and Fountaindale, due to the little tiny natural springs that were available and would pop up in the area. So Robert Strong, that's where people ask, like, where do we get Fountaindale from? It was a locational place name. And it's wonderful for me to see Fountaindale in like one of my favorite families, you know, information. It just makes me super happy and giddy as a library person and as a librarian and as a genealogist. So the Robert Strong farm is actually, if you guys are going down Royce Road from 53 and you're driving across Royce Road to go toward Naperville, you'll actually, their house would be what is now on the corner of what is the Walnut Ridge subdivision in Naperville. And you can kind of see what their house looks like there. So that's somebody, you'll see that there are the horses, there are the steers, there's the sheep, there's a couple of the pigs. And the Robert Strong house wasn't very big. It was the house, a couple outhouses, and then the side barn. But what the Strong family today, and actually if you go to the DuPage River Park, Robert Strong not only owned the land that was behind in the Walnut Ridge subdivision, but was also what would be forward toward the DuPage Riverwalk, and not quite to the Riverwalk Park, but the land that you're walking on to get to the DuPage River Park. So when you're on that property across from Walnut Ridge, you know you're on Robert Strong land. Now, the interesting bit from here, it actually takes place because of his son, Robert Hale Strong, who was a private in the Illinois infantry during the Civil War. Now, this is interesting bit. People think that military service from the Civil War, that you could be as young as 12 and just kind of run off. That's not what the law was at that time period. That if you were a young man like Robert, you were as basically kind of under your father's supervision until you were 21 and you gained your majority. That's when you, at 21, you were able to cut off and to go do your own thing and to just leave the family farm. But you were required to stay until you were 21 under many state laws, because you had to be there to help your father. So in the case of Robert Hale Strong, he really wanted to go fight in the Civil War, and he was 18. And he felt he was old enough. And yes, in a lot of places we would think, yes, today 18-year-olds can go off and fight. So Robert should have been able to, but his father was really reluctant to, especially at the beginning of the war. And it wasn't until 1862 that he was able to go. Now, this is an excerpt from his book, or from his personal letters that would eventually become a book called A Yankee Private Civil War. And so we actually get to hear Robert Hailstrong's point of view from this time period, growing up on this farm in Will County. So as he says, his father said, if you wish to enlist now, now is your time to go. So I think that I can kind of see Robert Hailstrong saying, like, I just don't want to be in here. Like, there's a war to fight. I want to go. I want to win glory. I want to go out there. I want to go serve my country. And you can kind of see his father kind of eventually giving in. Well, he is old enough now. He's 18, almost 19. I guess he can go. It had to be a really, really horrible time, because there were so many other people in this area who had sons who were enlisting, and then in many cases, like the Ingleses, where their sons are dying, and they might not have been in a place where they could have had their bodies shipped home. So it would not have been something that Robert Strong Sr. would have taken lightly. But as a case, Robert Hailstrong ended up serving in his infantry division, actually with Mark Napier, who was the son of John Napier, who founded Naperville. So the two of them were close friends, and they served together in the same unit. And they were in a regiment that ended up not only in some of the heaviest fighting in certain areas of the Civil War, but were also there for the siege of Atlanta in 1864. So he wrote more or less that we have a great photograph in the National Archives here, that there were always snipers, there were always Confederate snipers around, that yes, they knew that by destroying the railroad, they would not be able to get any more reinforcements, they would not be able to get any additional supplies, so they were really on their own once they destroyed the railroad tracks outside of Atlanta. But he was there, from our understanding, when Atlanta burned to the ground. Now, another thing that Robert Hailstrong, in his experience, he ended up as part of Sherman's March to the Sea, which went from Atlanta down to Savannah. Now, there were multiple, it's not as simple as like, we're all going to get in line. You're going, you're going, you're going, I'm going, we're all going to march to Savannah. That's not necessarily the case. It really was a lot like the Expendables, where they were given a certain amount of food, a certain amount of water, and then they're going to have to just kind of figure out food along the way. So whether that's hunting, fishing, fighting, trapping, stealing it from local people, whatever it was, they're going to march from Atlanta down to Savannah. So they lived off the country so much that Robert Strong says that we had nothing to eat for 24 hours because it was few and far between there. So, of course, he leaves the military. He makes it through the war. He actually was in Savannah at the time that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and he talks about how he and the other men from his infantry unit were absolutely so livid about this that because they were contained, the higher ups in that infantry union are like, well, we don't want to cause a problem. We don't want to have looting. We don't want to have some other issues and any outbursts of anger, because that's not what the president wanted. So eventually they would leave Savannah by ship and go back up to Washington, D.C., were part of some of the huge parades that were going through D.C. at the end of the war. And then eventually he was able to take a train back to Chicago. He was in Chicago at the end of the war, and he saw his friend, James George, who was a hospital orderly in Chicago. He's the second veteran who's buried in our Boardman Cemetery. And he saw his friend and said, hey, I wasn't given leave and I missed the train. You lend me $5 to jump on the train and go home? And James George says, I know where you live, so at least your dad will have the money, So he gives his friend $5, and Robert Hailstrong gets on the train, buys a train ticket, takes it all the way to the Naperville train station, and then walks home because nobody is there to pick him up. Nobody knows. But this is an excerpt from his letters that I absolutely love. So I can really envision him doing this, walking from the train station, couple of hours to get back to his parents' farm off Royce Road. And he says that he kind of sat there on that creek. He'd been away for almost, or at least 2 years, if not a little bit longer, and that he just looked at home he hadn't seen for so long. and didn't know whether or not to sleep in the barn or to actually knock on the door. It was so late. But his brother was up and he said, "Hey, Al," and they start hugging each other, just really, really happy. And then there's Robert Strong, who probably didn't know, is my son still alive? We don't know what's going on. And then he hears that his son has come home, and his wife Caroline is there as well. So all of them just started hugging each other and staying up and talking and drinking coffee all night. It had to be like an amazing sort of that homecoming. And it's so wonderful because we know exactly where it took place. And we know it exactly when it took place. And we know that exactly the house and everything, what it looked like, all because of these two guys. And at least one of them is buried in our cemetery. The other one is sadly not. He's out in Arkansas. But that wonderful, wonderful story takes place right here in our little community. So that's what I love about our cemetery. So if you want to read more about Yankee Private Civil War, you can get it at least from our local library. We have several copies, but you can also buy it. You can buy it online. You can buy it as an ebook. Really, really, really great stuff. And unfortunately, we do know where Robert Hailstrong is buried in Arkansas, a nice little cemetery that's out there. But his wife, Nina Paxton, who Paxton Drive is named for, at least for her family, Nina is buried in Boardman. Unfortunately, she passed, and Robert is buried with his second wife out in Arkansas. But please read more in the Yankee Private Civil War. I'll give you a full disclaimer that there are some culturally insensitive items due to the time period that the items were written. So you've been warned that there's some always historical things you need to keep in mind when you're reading that book. So anyway, so let's leave the strong plots and let's move off to the last family that we're going to talk about today, and that is the Royce family. This is Jonathan and Polly Royce, who Royce Road is named for. So you'll see that there is a commemorative stone here for Polly Emery Royce, and then we have the dual stone together for Jonathan and Polly Royce together. Now, the Royce farm itself is closer to what we would think of as Napier Boulevard and what would be Royce Road and Napier Boulevard. So if you're actually on the DuPage River Trail that's taking you up into Naperville, that's part of the old Royce homestead. Both of those areas of that Royce Road that's where we get the term Royce Road. This is what the house looked like. Now, the house would have been a little bit closer down south away from Naperville, but still on what we would consider that main road that leads up into Naperville. So they were primarily, a lot of what they had were in horses and in cattle. So you'll see that a lot in the picture and the imagery of their farm at that time period. So Jonathan Royce himself, besides at one point was one of the largest landowners of the area, who owned almost 3,000 acres of land. What was actually, I think, a little bit more interesting, this is one of the few exceptions where we actually know quite a bit more about his wife, Polly Emery Royce. Now, the headstone that was placed there, or the marker that was placed in 2010 by the Fort Payne chapter of the National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution, that was actually because she's considered in the DAR as a real daughter of the Revolution, because her father had served in the Revolutionary War and had been with Washington since the crossing of the Delaware all the way to the Battle of Yorktown. So we know so much about Polly and her family because of her father's Revolutionary War service. So it's amazing. We have a really great marker for Polly here. In this end, Jonathan might have owned a lot of land, but Polly's father was like a big deal, which made Polly a big deal. When she passed away at the age of 90, there were over 100 people at her funeral. So because we know where she's buried, if we can imagine the buggies and the other type of people walking to come to this service, most of it were her children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, all gathered to pay their respects at her side when she passed. So you'll see a lot about Polly basically being like the best of companions, or the mother of this huge brood of children who was patient, who was kind. But you see a lot of this very big fortitude that she and her husbands were companions at heart and companions at home. and companions on life together, as they were married for over 60 years. So I'm really looking forward to learning more about Polly Royce as we go along, and about her experiences, about Caroline Strong and her experiences, and so many of the other women who are buried in our cemetery. That'll be in a future presentation that we'll give on the women of Boardman. And we're also looking forward to doing a program between Boardman Cemetery and Hillcrest Cemetery about our veterans who are buried in both of our cemeteries. And so with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for attending our Boardman Cemetery open house virtual tour, just in time for Halloween, but not quite a Halloween tour. But thank you guys so much for watching this. Remember to like, subscribe, to share. Please feel free to refer people to our beautiful virtual cemetery tour. And if you know of anybody who needs help or advice on how to restore their own historic cemetery, or how to plan a ground penetrating radar project, or even how to give a tour and how to film these tours, we're always happy to help out. So contact the Bolingbrook Historic Preservation Commission or the Fountaindale Public Library. Either way, we're happy to help. And so with that, I will wish you all a really, really great day, and we hope to see you soon in the cemetery.